I think you've got the intro today, Gabby.
Yeah, I'm just getting our record on. And then we'll be good to go. Welcome to Everyone's Welcome, a fresh conversation about disability. We've got a great conversation planned for today. And we're so thankful to you for joining us. We're actually celebrating our first anniversary of Everyone's Welcome. Oh, and we'll ask everyone just to be on mute. Shelley, you could go ahead and mute folks while we're getting started. Okay. Thank you. This is our first anniversary of Everyone's Welcome. Our first show was on May 5th, 2020, when we welcomed Dr. Karen Hills to talk about her work with non-speaking people with autism, and it was all about their spirituality. It was a great episode, and from there we just kept going. Including today's episode, we've now produced a total of 22 programs, and all of them are posted on the jkidaccess.org website. So you can go back and check out any that you haven't had a chance to see yet. We created Everyone's Welcome to provide the opportunity for our audience to connect, to learn, to be part of a greater community, bringing together people for conversations around disability and mental health. Our guests stop by to share their experience and their stories that provide food for thought as we all now are navigating this world we're in together. Everyone's Welcome is a collaboration between Whole Community Inclusion at Jewish Learning Venture and Inclusion Innovation. Everyone's Welcome is captioned. You can click the CC icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen and click on View Captions. We are recording Everyone's Welcome, and in just a moment, we're gonna broadcast it to Facebook Live, but don't worry, we'll spotlight our guest, Anne's video. If you're at all concerned, you can turn off your screen.
Can I turn mine off?
Oh, Anne, we need you for sure. We will send an email to you with a link to the recording when it's up, and we invite you to share this and also all of our previous episodes with people in your life. And your questions and comments are welcome, and we'll use the chat and have time at the end to direct some questions towards Anne.
Great, thanks, Gabby, and welcome everybody. I'm Shelley Christensen. We just want to add too that we have really loved producing Everyone's Welcome, and we appreciate the warm reception that we've had with so many individuals and organizations joining us. And as always, we invite you, encourage you, and are incredibly thankful to you when you share Everyone's Welcome with your colleagues and friends, your family, your dog, everybody. Well, we're starting our second season in a major way with our friend and colleague, Dr. Ann Masters. Ann and I have been friends and colleagues, I think it's over 10 years now, and it's through our work at the intersection of interfaith inclusion, theology, and disability through the American Association on Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities. It's been so much fun to watch your journey towards your PhD, Ann. I just love all of your insights, and you're going to be sharing much of that. Thank you. So let me tell you about Anne. She is a PhD. She has earned her PhD. She's the director of the Office for Pastoral Ministries, for pastoral ministry with persons with disabilities for the Archdiocese of Newark. Anne's work is to foster the appreciation of individuals with disabilities as indispensable members of the church, to empower parishes to support meaningful participation in all aspects of congregational life, and to accompany families on their faith journeys. Anne is particularly interested in individuals with autism, learning to attend Mass and participating fully in parish life. She draws on evidence-based practices to promote synergy between church belief statements and pastoral activity. Her published writing includes both academic and pastoral works, and she presents on theology, adaptive oh my gosh,
Catechesis.
catechetical,
Or
thank
catechetical
you,
practice.
catechesis, catechetical, yes, and supportive pastoral practices in the US and in Europe, and collaborates with Catholic and interfaith partners, which is our work together. And she contributes to the work of the National Catholic Partnership on Disabilities, which is also known as NCPD, and is a fellow of the American Association on Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities, which many of you know, AAIDD, and is past president of its Religion and Spirituality Interest Group, and was awarded her Ph.D. in Theology in 2020 for her thesis, Who Do You Say That I Am? Overcoming the Marginalization of Individuals with Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities in the US and Catholic Church. Welcome, Anne. We are so happy to have you here to share your incredible body of work with us.
Thank you, Shelley and Gabby. It's great to be here, and for everyone that's participating in this conversation.
And we are calling today's conversation Created in God's Image, Reconciling Perspectives on Rights and Charity in Faith Communities. Can you tell us how you became interested in charity and why?
Sure. I should start probably by introducing my thesis and the motivation behind it, which was to respond to the question, why are individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities marginalized in the US Catholic Church? By marginalized, I mean, why are they typically relegated to segregated spaces that are based on perceived intellectual abilities and excluded from the ordinary spaces and activities and roles in the church, such as Sunday Eucharist, sacrament celebrations, ministry, and other activities? This happens in society as well, but the church, by its very nature, is supposed to have different values. Priority for human dignity, with all that implies, which is stated both in our general documents of the church and also one specifically about individuals with disabilities. So while I'm sharing today, I have to say up front, I'm speaking predominantly from the Catholic Christian perspective, but I also do have sources and insights into Jewish tradition as well, both from my relationship with Shelley and also from Rabbi Julia Watts has shared some resources. So that has been, I think, helps to round it, I feel, is a really important part of the overall story. So I'm glad to be able to do that. But, you know, so as I started working in this ministry, I met many parents who over the years insisted their sons and daughters to participate within the full life of the church, not in segregated programs. And in fact, one mom said that the church would be her son's community for life. It would outlive that of her relationship with her and her husband. So it was important that he be connected and also to feel like he belonged. Then I also met other people, such as Renee, who's a woman who has cerebral palsy, who says she often feels like she doesn't belong in the church because of the way she is treated. So when I began my research, I was looking at, you know, what are the perceptions of individuals with IDD throughout history, even though that language is very modern, and wasn't even, you know, so it wasn't started until like the later in the 20th century. And so, but still I discovered, I did discover an accusation by a social scientist who, you know, complained that it was the rule of Saint Benedict was responsible for patronizing and sentimentalizing attitudes about individuals with IDD. And so I thought, okay, great, I've got the answer. It's, you know, Benedict is the problem. And so while it wasn't an exhaustive analysis, but it was enough provides a sense of some shifting trends that may have influenced the issues that we're dealing with today. And, you know, so I began with looking at the inherited Jewish tradition, which of charity, which is concerned with the physical sustenance and also the social impacts of poverty, looking at the, you know, being a holistic concern for the person, which is also consistent with the early Christian perspective. You know, I'm sure our audience is very familiar with the text, both, you know, Hebrew and Christian, where both in Leviticus and the Gospel according to Mark, Luke, and Matthew, where you shall love your neighbor as yourself. And then also in Leviticus, you shall treat the alien who resides with you no differently than the natives born among you. You shall love the alien as yourself, for you too were once aliens in the land of Egypt. That points to identification, recognizing oneself in the alien and the alien in me. And that's going to be an important point that comes up later. But, you know, without getting too buried into the weeds of the history, there were two particular points in time in the early development that I'll point out. In the 4th century, in the standard ecclesial structures for both Jewish and Christian faith traditions, there was a consolidation of power a bit that for consolidating economic, political, and religious power that had the potential for corruption as well as sincerity. So there were some issues there. But then also there was the monastic tradition that was coming from the Eastern Church, Christian Church, that included Benedict of Nicaea, who wrote the Rule of Saint Benedict, and he's widely considered the father of Western monasticism. But you know what was interesting is, as much as I went through that, I could find no evidence of the guilt that was laid on him by this author, the Christian social scientist. You know, both in the rule, which is actually very small, and nor in any documentation about his time. He wrote a simple rule for beginners to provide a simple path of holiness for his monks. There was a strong sense of hospitality, concern for the stranger. Their life centered on prayer, work, and hospitality. And charity was considered a holy obligation because everything belonged to God. So therefore, it was to be used in service of God and required a sincere heart. So false senses of charity wouldn't even qualify. But then, as we go later in time, in the 9th century, at the beginning of the, there's a huge shift at the inception of the Holy Roman Empire. And this is when the emperor and the Pope form an alliance. And so now the church has become sort of the charity arm of the Holy Roman Empire. And you know what they decide, and so in this process, it's essentially they established a large feudal system, and abbeys and abbots became political as well as economic forces. That doesn't mean they were all insincere or abusing their roles, but that's where it started to happen, because now they took the Rule of Saint Benedict, which was very simple and flexible, intentionally flexible, to allow for adaptability in the local monastery. That was its initial charm, but then they kept making it more and more unified and codified to actually impose rigidity to restrict that flexibility. Other thing is that Latin was no longer the spoken language of the people. So you have the monks that were still involved in prayer, speaking Latin, and also academic works. And as the expansion of the institution, the institution of charity, the monks were no longer doing that work. Now there's a new tier of role called the conversi, which was essentially lay people that could themselves have been on the streets if they didn't have this work. And so now you have the work of charity being done without the sense of charity, or the heart for charity, if you will. So again, just to remind you, this wasn't an exhaustive analysis, but I think these are really interesting points that point to the issues that, the issues we're dealing with today. And the thing that happened back then, disability actually wasn't a concern so much overall, it was more poverty and economic dependency that was the issue. But today, individuals with disabilities, particularly intellectual and developmental, continue to often be trapped within the sense of a set of false narratives that reinforce dependency and vulnerability rather than affirming dignity and the potential and the potential to grow. So for example, in 2016, Pope Francis's Twitter account promoted his encyclical on love in the family, saying that people with disabilities are a gift for the family and an opportunity to grow in love, mutual aid, and unity. You can imagine that went over really well with some people.
Can imagine.
Yeah, Kayla Whaley, who is a disability rights activist, reacted to the quote, saying, "We are not gifts to teach abled people about love." There were many other people, individuals with disabilities, parents, advocates also, that really challenged Pope Francis. And I will say, he has listened and changed his language, but him saying that in 2016 is a good example of what is still a pervasive perspective by many. And so essentially, charity has a major PR problem. And
Well, I was going to ask you that. Sorry to interrupt. I was going to ask you about that. And I, I think, and by the way, thank you for that very insightful overview. It really reminded me of my modern European history course that I took in college, where so much of it was focused on the church, the Holy Roman Empire, and the convergence of, which really historically now we look at the church and we look under the lens of disability and also poverty and marginalization. So the question, this is a two-part question for you, Anne. Why now is the context of rights and not charity so important to people with disabilities right at this moment? And that's the first part. The second part is, why do you think there's a case for rights and charity?
so, rights, not charity, is a sentiment that grew out of grew in the disability movement as it has gained traction alongside the civil rights movement. And recognizing this and supporting civil rights is important. So rights are important. I am not questioning that at all. It's absolutely correct to reject the co-opted version of charity that I described. There are just too many examples where rights have been abused in all of history. So that's really important. And again, the co-opted version that's based on longstanding stereotypes, that is not helpful, because then it portrays individuals with disabilities as more objects of pity and instruments for others to become better people. So it essentially generates narratives that discount them as persons of interest in their own right and the ability to contribute to community. Citing again Pope Francis's encyclical on love in the family, there were 4 paragraphs talking about individuals with disabilities, and essentially it was focused on the impact of living with disability on the family, the opportunities for the family members to grow in a capacity for love. And so this is consistent with the charity thread, which was actually the first thread of the shadow narrative I discovered. And that was, because from the beginning of ministry in the church, the goal was full, integrated, meaningful participation of individuals with intellectual disabilities. And this is back in the 1960s. But it also, in the forming, constitution for the ministry, ... and for the positive Christian attitude and behaviors their presence elicits in others. So from that very beginning, we have the tension of full, meaningful, integrated participation, yet also how their presence impacts others.
And can I ask you?
Oh, so the case for rights and charity, I didn't answer that yet.
Okay, all right. Why don't you do that part, and then I want to ask you more about the narrative. So go ahead.
So why do I think there's a case for rights and charity? That rights are very important. But we also must recognize the limitations of only focusing on rights, because we cannot legislate people's hearts. And also, because of the pervasive false narratives that I love the cup, Shelley, because of the pervasive attitudes about individuals with disabilities that are held by many, a lot of times employers or just people in their lives don't have the expectations. And so our opportunities are limited. And then when there are violations to legislation, the burden of proof is on individuals with disabilities, who often are, because of being trapped within these false narratives, they don't have the same positions of power. So then remembering that knowing that there have been shifts where our original sense of charity and what it's called to be has had shifts over time, and we've gotten away from it. Well, if we could recover that. And here I'll give some examples just actually from Pope Benedict Emeritus. In his encyclical on charity and truth, he actually has some beautiful things to say. He first of all acknowledges the problem with charity as it's currently often implemented. And he says that it's important to have truth in charity that views the person in their fullness, as well as a charity in truth which sees with the eyes of love. So in other words, to recognize the person who they are rather than as I want them to be, but or think they should be, or what they need, but also to not judge harshly and to be compassionate. And and then he goes on further to say that, and this is really important, to support human development, which is integral to a person's vocation, is because we honor God's gift of life in doing this. That just living it, so developing ourselves to the best we can, as given who that is what's important. That is using the gift of life from God. And so he says, charity doesn't exclude knowledge, it requires it.
Mhm.
Deeds without knowledge are blind. Knowledge without love is sterile. And indeed, the individual who is animated by true charity labors skillfully to discover the causes of misery to find the means to combat it. I mean, that's just powerful, and a very challenging call, but yet I think that's the vision we're set to.
Thank you, Anne. That's very helpful. And we're going to go even deeper now. You've given us already so much to think about. I want to ask you about this idea of the shadow narratives. That there are 5 threads you've talked about that run counter to the concept of B'Tselem Elohim, that which are the Hebrew words for being created in God's image, which first we find in the book of Genesis in the creation story, and it runs through our diverse theologies. What are the problematic threads of the shadow narrative?
Sure. So well, there are, so first of all, so the reason I named it the shadow narrative, and this comes out of the Christian practice that refers to the gospel of Jesus as a metaphor for is light, light for the world. But I think light is also a strong metaphor for truth and power, and so for me, the shadow narrative, because it's a false narrative that eclipses the light of the gospel, or eclipses light. It also, when you think of use of it for like shadow governments, it's like something that's sinister and hidden. And so that, that's where I got the term shadow narrative. And so it's a meta narrative that has the 5 that have the 5 threads, but it essentially, it operates at an unconscious level, but so these 5 narratives that I've identified are a subset of a much larger set of narratives that have been with us through human society. In process of building community and culture, there's a mixture of shared and valued characteristics in a community. And community will identify, that's essentially the foundation for building human society, and that guides sharing of practices and resources, figuring out who can be trusted, who can't be trusted, who's in my tribe, who's not in my tribe. And so these narratives developed that validate these perspectives, but they operate on, once they're established, then they operate unconsciously. So they become really entrenched. In fact, psychologists tell us that the ability to feel empathy for one's offspring, clan, others in one's group, as well as not feel empathy for outsiders, has been a part of human evolution that really contributes to the whole tribalism and group community cohesion. So that's an important, it's part of how we're wired, which is important for us to understand. But because it operates at the unconscious level, so we've got these set of shared values and characteristics that are operating, what Tom Reynolds has called for is referred to as the cult of normalcy. And so anyone who doesn't belong within the normative culture essentially becomes devalued and thus marginalized. And so the more valued you are, the more social currency you have to participate in community. The less valued you are, the less valued characteristics, then the less currency you have. And related to that, someone with strong social currency is able to get away with different behaviors, or acting differently, or being or going off point at times, because they've got reserve to work with, right? Whereas people with very little currency, it's tough. There's no room, because anything they do that reinforces differentness is just going to reinforce expectations that they're not valuable. So, but then the impact of this also on folks who are devalued is it's very wounding, right? These expectations that get put on people it makes it harder and harder to actually believe they could do other. They become socialized, essentially, that they can't do anything. And so it doesn't just restrict access to the good things in life, it actually hurts people inside themselves that tends to perpetuate itself. So that's a really important thing to consider. Now I'm getting it to what are the 5 threads?
Yes. But I want to,
Oh, sure.
but also, Anne, you know, and I know we've talked about this so much about people being devalued, and it's kind of, I really want to use the word horrifying, the impact on people's lives when the one place that we, you know, that one presumes there's welcome, there's connection to spirituality, there's connection to like people interested in the same things, that's the religious community, faith community is still struggling or not wholeheartedly diving into the idea that people with disabilities have as much to offer in their own unique way as individuals as anyone else. And I know you and I have had that conversation many, many times. So this insight is great. And I didn't mean to interrupt you, but because the 5 threads are really important.
And it does put, it brings that, I mean, because it does highlight and bring to the conversation, remembering, so people of faith have good intentions. You know, the intentions are positive, but the challenge is that we're trapped by our past and history, because, as I said, the narratives, these narratives are underground, they're unconscious. And that's another reason I like the reference shadow narrative. So the 5 threads that I identified looking at, you know, the development of the US history of this ministry in the church, and also in some of our documents, you know, the first one is like the holy innocent, perpetual child, perpetual state of grace. And so, you know, these specifically are related to individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities. So, you know, talking about a 45-year-old man as if he's a 5-year-old boy, and not recognizing the developmental stages that he is a man, yet, you know, with different abilities, because we all are diverse. Then there's the charity, you know, as to our conversation today, the charity thread, which is the object of pity and the opportunity for service to provide others, you know, to become better people. The third one is that there's a special connection with Jesus and the cross, that their life of suffering is somehow an example for everyone else, maybe even has some redemptive value. And then there's the fourth one, which says idealism. In other words, you try your best, you know, you do what you can, but if it doesn't work, don't worry, because one of the other 3 is really operative. In other words, God has them covered. And so God's not going to let anyone go. But then there's the 5th one, which I also have encountered, is that, well, they're not really quite like us. They're other, perhaps totally other, not really human. And so that's just really, yeah, that's very upsetting when that happens. But if I could, there are 2 stories about 2 individuals, if I could share that may illustrate them a bit. You know, Renee is a blogger, and identifies herself as a former pit bull advocate for the Ability Center in Toledo, Ohio. Renee, she also has cerebral palsy. Renee is married. When she and her husband Floris are out to dinner, people will come up and bless him and say what a good man he is, and, you know, where he's with the woman he loves, you know, but they just see Renee as someone who is to be pitied and taken care of. They don't see her wit, her, you know, so she uses an electric wheelchair. She, her enunciation is, you know, you have to tune your ear to understand her words, and she doesn't have great fine motor control, and she uses a lot of napkins when she eats. But she's funny, she's bright, and her written language is very articulate. And so, but yet they don't see that. So, you know, both Renee and Floris are seen through the charity thread, which it's really the perverted form of charity, and, you know, because they're objects of pity. But then David is a man who was born with cerebral palsy in the 1940s. Now, David just died actually on Good Friday morning after being in hospice for 2 years. But his parents were told 3 times that he should be institutionalized. He would never live a life worth living. He wouldn't talk, and he would only take away from their other children. But his parents said no. And, you know, again, the doctors were seeing David through the lens of the not really human lens. But he grew up in a family that valued him, loved him, nurtured him. He worked full-time for 45 years for the US Postal Service, commuting from Bergenfield, New Jersey to New York City. He was a mail handler. In fact, his income kept his mother and 3 younger siblings in their home when his dad prematurely died of a heart attack. He was active in parish ministry as the hospitality minister in the parish catechetical program for about 45 years also. And he also faithfully attended all of, we have a group for moms and dads of individuals with disabilities. They're 2 separate groups at that parish. And David attended faithfully from the beginning to remind the parents to always believe in possibilities and to be the voice of their sons and daughters. And he was, you know, we miss him terribly, but you know, David and Renee both had the benefit of people in their lives that nurtured them, believed in them, and valued them, and that helped them to develop resiliency, as well as to flourish to the best of they can. Which doesn't mean, again, they live fairly independently, but they both need or did need, you know, certain supports, and some folks need really a lot of support, but yet providing the opportunity to flourish to the best as one can, that's what we should be about as a community.
Absolutely. Flourishing is such an incredible concept. And it's like when people flourish, communities flourish, organizations flourish. It just builds capacity, it builds strength. It's such a really good word to kind of keep front and center. Well, Anne, this is so enlightening, and I'm not saying that as a pun because of shadow narrative, but you've encouraged us to see the roots and perpetuation of marginalization. And the first question, I have 2 questions for you. It's if you can tell us what the real costs are, because charity continues to be co-opted. The inherent belief that there are costs is often projected as expenditures that communities have to make, the faith communities have to make, but there's a real cost.
It's a human
keeping
cost.
People, right. So what are those real costs? Because particularly because of charity.
Well, so in marginalizing people with false narratives, you know, essentially what there's this sort of a figurative space that's often referred to as on the margins, at least in Christian conversations. I don't know if that happens in Jewish language too, but you know, it can become a sentimentalized space for almost for acceptance and personal transformation of people, to reach out to people, you know, people of the normative culture, to reach out to those on the margins through patronizing the platitudes, you know. But what happened, it's like it's implied that, you know, Christ can only be found in the people on the margins. We forget that Christ, you know, again, I'm speaking to the Christians on our call, but, you know, it's important to know the face of Christ can be found in every person, whether on the margins, in the center, or in between. And, you know, people who actually seem powerful in the normative culture often have an inner vulnerability that is just dying to be tapped and touched. So we have to remember that. But so what happens, you know, for those that are, you know, stuck on the margins? It's not, you know, statistics show that children and teens with intellectual and developmental disabilities are 4 times as likely to be bullied. As teens and adults, they're 4 times as likely to be victims of sexual or violent crimes. Individuals with IDD are 3 times as likely to live below the poverty level. And also when parents are, so even, you know, parents with, if they prenatally, the unborn child is diagnosed as having the potential for an anomaly or disability, 80% of the time they will choose abortion. Now this is actually approved even in states that want to limit abortion. You know, the possibility of disability is like then is a pass to have an abortion. And so, you know, it's important to recognize the deepness of the bias against individuals with disabilities that reveals.
So, and thank you for that. I'm sure we can all think of examples where charity or where treatment of people is really not following the intentions or the intent of really the theology and the practices that need to be in place. And is there a new narrative? Do you see a new narrative blossoming, or just a seed of a new narrative starting to?
And what I think the new narrative needs to reflect the full diversity of the human family. And so if we go back to, you know, again, within Judaism and Christianity, our identity based on created in the image of God, but Tselem Elohim, you know, there's a responsibility that's assumed in this too. First of all, that, you know, because God is present in each of us. And so we're each, you know, we are to make God present in the world in the details of our lives. But then building on that, in Christianity, it's the body of Christ. In Judaism, Erivut emphasizes our responsibility for each other, our interconnectedness and our mutuality. And I think that is just so important. So if we can form a culture that is solidly based on these two premises, but, you know, and here I had referred to psychologists, you know, psychologists work, but psychologists studying the motivated theory of empathy have shown where, you know, the importance of empathy is something that can be taught, but what's required is fostering identification, what's called interpersonal identification with each other. So someone that I think is totally different from me, but once I recognize a common experiences, share, you know, even if it's different than my personal ones, but the feelings and emotions attached to them, that forms that identification, and that helps to create the awareness. And so again, motivation theory of empathy, they've actually shown where intentionally fostering that can help to change people's mind, and also showing where past abuses have happened, and hearing the personal stories about the impact that has can make a change for people. And they've actually used curriculum first in schools to counter bullying, you know, the curriculums for developing empathy. There's a great study also working with medical professionals, teaching that to foster that empathy, and the motivated empathy is what we would also call compassion. What Benedict was saying, to understand the cause and to actually want to make a change and to impact change, not based on what I want. So I think that's, you know, that's really important. And the thing that as people of faith, again, a lot of folks are positively motivated. They'll talk about transformational experiences, someone who's been away from the church, they get involved in a program that is, you know, taking care of individuals with disabilities, and they feel so good about that now they want to come back to the church. But I have to caution that those personal transformative moments are actually at the expense of the individuals with disabilities, if it's stifling them into, like, you know, predefined spaces and expectations based on their abilities. I mean, I think it's really, this may sound strong, but I say that really when the church or people of faith engage with individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities, or any other marginalized group, really, you know, based on stereotypic expectations that are defined by these low expectations and diagnostic labels, then it really is denying human dignity. And I think we have to be careful about that. And it denies really the full implication of being created in the image of God.
Mm-hmm. And thank you so much for, as Shelley said, really shedding light on this narrative. And I love that we're sort of closing this part of the conversation with thinking of a new narrative. There are two comments that I want to share with you that folks were able to make during the conversation. And I welcome others, if you have a question or comment, to put it in the chat now. But earlier, when we were talking about charity at the beginning of the conversation, this is from Sarah. Why does the individual with disabilities have to be the recipient of charity? This individual can be giving charity as well.
Oh, you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. The problem, so I think what I've been talking about is the co-opted version of charity, which presumes individuals with disabilities are the receivers, not givers. So for example, so the name of this office, Pastoral Ministry with Persons with Disabilities. It's a lot of words. It's a tongue twister. I've got a file that I've kept the envelopes from Christmas cards from different offices in the Archdiocesan Center. At times there's the ministry to the disabled, ministry for the disabled, but my favorite one is the disabled ministry. What is, I tend to, when I first started working in this ministry, I would often kind of do lessons on prepositions and grammar, trying to put, I walk with people, I don't fix anyone. And it's something that, we're all called to walk together. So great point, absolutely.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. And I wanted to share something that Bill wrote, which was, it sounds like all of the 5 threads are about failing to perceive the unique life made in the image of the Creator who's before us, and objectifying that individual child of God in ways that reinforce our self-justifying, self-deceptive, false images of ourselves.
You're absolutely right. Yeah, I totally agree. Well spotted. I mean, it's well said.
Yeah, I think that's a real understanding of what you synthesized for us, Anne.
Yeah.
And of course, we, have enjoyed this hour or 45 minutes with Anne, and we are thinking ahead to our next episode. We're going to keep this conversation going. As anyone who's been with us before knows, it's never finished. And we've got an amazing guest coming up in our next episode. Shelley, tell us about what we have to look forward to.
Okay, there we go. I am so excited. I'm going to be talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we know this is really becoming a movement in all aspects of life. It's driving change in companies and nonprofits, faith communities, in our general communities as well. And DEI, DENI, as it's called, is, impacts not only people with disabilities, but people who are othered. And there's been such an important movement forward, and I'm really excited to share that with you and talk about some ways that DEI can be implemented in your organizations as well, faith communities, as well as other organizations. So,
Shelley, I just want to share, yes, it looks like on the slide, we couldn't see the date, but it will be May 25th.
Sorry. Oh dear.
That's okay. And we'll be sending an announcement out, so no worries, but it'll be May 25th. And Shelley is kind enough to share, part of this way that we're addressing this, Anne, at our organization, Jewish Learning Venture, is by creating materials to teach our youngest people. And this book, which is written with Jewish values, but I think is of interest to everyone, is called In My Kahila, a book about friends with disabilities. I'm the author, and my friend and colleague, Robin Matthews, is the illustrator. We shared about it a couple episodes ago. And if you go to our website, jewishlearningventure.org/inmykahila, you can get all your ordering information.
It looks like a great book.
Thank you. Thank you.
It is. I got my copies, a couple copies this last week, and it's just beautifully done, beautifully written and illustrated. And
Oh, thank you, Shelley. Thank you, Anne. And of course, Shelley and my books are up there too. My story of my great uncle's extraordinary life, The Little Gate Crasher, and Shelley's book, From Longing to Belonging, which again is an excellent resource for all faith communities.
It is. It's a great book.
Yeah, thanks,
Very
Anne.
much.
And we're, at all the places, Amazon, Barnes and Noble, Kindle. And we again just want to really, really from our hearts thank you for this conversation today on Everyone's Welcome. And we want to thank all of you for joining us today. We'll be sharing the recording. You can send it to your friends and colleagues, and we just hope everyone will stay well and safe until next time.
Yeah, thank you again for allowing me the opportunity for this conversation. It helps me to also kind of improve my own thinking and getting the word out. Thanks.
Absolutely. I think dialogue is the key. There's so much that we can all share. So thank you everyone for joining us, and thanks Anne for this is the first time I've heard everything that you have created, and it's amazing. Thanks all.
Thank you.